Um, so, yeah, our first question is, are we recording?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Our first question is just, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your current projects, or?
Okay, so in the area of connected and automated vehicles, my interests are mostly about how do they influence people's behaviors, and particularly do they stimulate additional demand for travel? So do people travel more because you've made driving safer, cheaper, and more convenient? We think the short answer is yes. The question is how much. And so that's what we are trying to dig into.
That would be hard to test.
It's hard to test. We got some fun ideas, but it's all highly uncertain. As we've looked also more broadly at the energy impacts, which include the demand response, as well as operational efficiency and changes in vehicle design that are enabled by automation.
Fantastic. Yeah, could you tell us more about the energy efficiency and
So like
studies or research you've done on
three, 4, 5 years ago, when everyone started talking about automation, vehicle automation a lot, it was very utopian, and a lot of people were focusing on energy efficiency. And I'll say that energy is kind of like not the driving force here. This is about safety, improving mobility for underserved groups. It's about productivity and sort of convenience. It's really not being driven by energy, but it does have profound implications for energy. That said, one of the many benefits that people were talking about is, this will make our transportation system so much more efficient because, number one, we can kind of optimize the operations of our vehicles. So vehicles use, especially internal combustion engine vehicles, use a lot more energy when they're moving at low speeds and in stop-and-go traffic. So people are like, well, we'll eliminate congestion and we'll get rid of traffic lights and you'll just get in. It's just a smooth trip start to finish. You use a lot less energy. And this will make Uber more attractive than owning your own car because you won't be paying for a driver. So everyone will just use Uber, and then that opens up all these other opportunities. It's very utopian, and so, but a lot of that was focused on the energy efficiency piece. And so what we did is we kind of dug into that, and we said, yes, there's a lot of opportunity in energy efficiency, but there's also a lot of risk for increased energy demand. And we don't know how those balance out, and we don't know the extent to which people are actually going to replace private vehicle ownership with mobility services.
I had a follow-up question for that. So you mentioned that there were profound implications for energy. One of the things that we were curious about is, I guess maybe in my own mind, I made the assumption that these fleets of autonomous vehicles would be largely electrical, so they'd be relying on...
Yeah, everyone makes that leap. I'm not sure why.
Okay, so there isn't necessarily a...
I mean, there are potentially some synergies, but it's not obvious to me that one necessarily follows from the other. So reasons that electric might be more attractive when you have automation. So one is that, and particularly when you have automation and connectivity, even without a self-driving car, if you have a smarter car with cloud connectivity, it can anticipate where charging is available. It can update and get smarter algorithms for predicting your remaining range, updated based on weather and traffic. And so you can mitigate range anxiety. Basically, you can push responsibility for getting you to your destination without running out of charge. You push that off onto the vehicle, and therefore the driver just doesn't have to worry about it. So range anxiety goes away, and this is seen as being a big obstacle to EV adoption. Another reason is the infrastructure costs. So once you do get into self-driving, maybe you don't need charging infrastructure in as many places so that vehicle can drive itself off and recharge it. That's another. And then finally, if you move to fleets, to on-demand fleets, mobility as a service fleets, then that does a couple things. And the biggest thing is that you probably accumulate miles faster. So if this vehicle is in service, it's not going to be 24 hours a day. They're not all going to be in service 24 hours a day. But if your vehicles are running on average, say, 10 hours a day at 20 miles an hour, it's 200 miles a day, it's like 70,000 miles a year. That vehicle's gonna have like a 2 to 3 year life. And so when you look at the savings that come from operating an EV, those are fuel cost savings, right? And typically those are spread out over a 15-year life, and this fuel savings 15 years out are not worth much, right, when you discount them back to the present. So by compressing all that useful life into just a couple of years, the present value of those savings is higher, so there's a better economic case for electrification. But again, it doesn't necessarily follow. So yes, it might work, but this is more something that we should be looking to as an opportunity. This is what folks are calling ACEs or FAVEs. It's like autonomous, connected, electric, and shared, or fleets of autonomous vehicles, electric and shared. So this idea of having like sharing and electrification along with automation is seen as sort of a desirable outcome and an opportunity, but I think the risk we run is when we assume that when we talk about what could happen and we'd like to happen, and then we mistake that for what is going to happen,
So
which happens a lot.
So they're compatible, and perhaps they complement each other, but they're not dependent, and they're no...
Right, there's no necessary link between the two.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
I guess kind of going off that, do you think there needs to be a large change in infrastructure and power grids for that to happen?
So when you talk about infrastructure, you're talking about, so you mentioned the power grid, or are you talking about the transportation infrastructure as well?
I mean, yeah, all inclusive, I would say. So like the highway system, for example, thinking about like autonomous trucking.
I think that any autonomous vehicle technology that relies on dedicated infrastructure is doomed to fail. We've tried to promote alternative technologies that have infrastructure requirements, particularly with alternative fuels, and it's just too expensive to build this stuff. And in particular, when you think about, like, if you're talking about if you need like special lanes of some kind, yeah, that'll make sense at some point in the distant future. But if you're talking, there's a huge opportunity cost, right? So you take away a general purpose lane today, and you're basically, imposing this huge cost on everyone who uses those lanes today, because they're going to be forced into fewer lanes, and they're going to, experience a huge amount of traffic congestion. And we have today 0 autonomous vehicles on the road, right? Other than like test fleets. Okay, actually, maybe I shouldn't say 0. Effectively 0. We'll round it down to 0, right? 0% certainly. So you're going to have massive public pushback on any effort to take away right-of-way and reallocate it to autonomous vehicles. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I don't see that being viable. So you need, from a technology standpoint, you need a technology that's compatible with the existing infrastructure. And again, at some point in the future, when these things are 20, 30, 50, I don't know where the tipping point is, right? But when they're like a substantial portion of the fleet, not just new vehicle sales, but of the fleet, then it might make sense, right? When they're 20% of the traffic, maybe you turn over 1 out of 5 lanes on a major freeway. But I don't see that as being viable in the near term.
When you were saying that them depending on an infrastructure would be bad, do you mean that they should be like adaptable and whatnot, or? So
there's some people who think that like we need these vehicles that, well, there's a few things out there. Some people think, we need to have like V2I connectivity, vehicle to infrastructure connectivity for these to work. There's some people who think that they need a dedicated lane if you're going to allow these things to run autonomously. And so when it comes to like dedicated V2I connectivity, we've done that in some places. It's incredibly expensive because you're basically putting out, Wi-Fi routers every 500 meters along, or every kilometer along the road that these things are going to talk to. It's just massively expensive, and you have to wire them up, right? So what's a smarter approach is maybe you can get some V2V connectivity, because there sort of the costs are diffused across new vehicle buyers. So you put in a mandate that you have V2V capability on the vehicles, but you don't incur this huge public expense of wiring up the roadways. The other thing is if you use commercial wireless networks, which is really makes a lot of sense for anything that's not safety critical, anything that doesn't need like millisecond level and incredibly high reliability. That makes a lot more sense to send through commercial wireless networks than through V2V, what they call dedicated short range communication, DSRC, if you've heard about that. So the idea is that you want something that's compatible with the existing infrastructure, and as you might know, right, this is sort of a generally accepted principle for like architecting complex systems. Is you want the system as you build it out to be stable along the way. You want there to be an incentive for adoption at every step of the way, essentially.
Okay, what areas of industry outside of automotive do you think will be most impacted by the widespread use of AV technology?
Haven't thought about that.
Okay. Just, does
I mean,
anything come to mind?
outside of transportation? You say which areas will be impacted, or which one would be most impacted? I definitely can't give you the most.
Okay.
And I think like retail is going to have a huge impact, right? I mean, it already is just with online purchasing. And so that's pretty adjacent to transportation now. That's probably the big one. Yeah.
Okay. How do you anticipate public policies will change in response to preparation for autonomous vehicles?
Change in response what?
How do you anticipate public policies will change in response or preparation for autonomous vehicles?
In response or preparation?
Yeah.
It'll probably mostly be in response. I mean, some states are now putting in laws to like allow for testing and so on, and to regulate testing. In general, I think a lot of the policy response will be reactive, just because that's the way these things go. I think what we're going to see is that when you have self-driving, even if it's not fully self-driving, if you can self-drive over a significant number of driving situations, the risk you run is that you make people want to travel more, you make people more willing to undertake commutes, and the reason is the cost of the driver's time is the single largest component of the total cost of operating a vehicle. And so you take that away, and you've basically taken away the biggest portion of the cost, which means people will travel more. And how do you then stop that? Well, okay, do you want to stop that? Well, what we find is that when people travel a lot, they impose external costs on other travelers, right? Through congestion, through using roadway capacity, right? Roadway capacity in the short term is finite, and so by traveling more, you are, depriving others of, the quality of roadway that's available, and you're basically increasing travel times for other travelers. So this is an externality, and it's unpriced. And so I think the most important policy response is probably going to be that we need to either price our roads or price travel in some other way. So either have like congestion pricing, tolling, or a crude instrument would be like VMT fees, vehicle miles traveled fees. But that's pretty crude because again, these external costs are very sensitive to time and space, right? I mean, I-5 is heavily congested, but not at midnight. So it's if someone's accumulating all their miles in off-peak hours, it's not that big a deal. But if you're increasing peak hour demand, then you're increasing these external costs, and we're going to need to start pricing that. Will policymakers do it? I don't know, right? I mean, I think it's going to have to be. The writing's going to have to be on the wall. So I think things are going to have to get pretty bad before a lot of jurisdictions move ahead on this. I think an opportunity for policymakers is to act in the near term and basically impose these prices on self-driving cars. And that's not without its risks. The risk being that why are you doing that? Well, to manage congestion and travel demand and energy consumption. But what that ends up doing is it acts as a deterrent to the adoption of these vehicles in general. And therefore you basically are taxing a product that offers huge safety benefits. And so that could be an undesirable outcome. But I think that could be from how do you get this, how do you allow this to happen? How do you get this tax regime in place, this road pricing regime in place? If you sort of start from the premise that all vehicles are going to be automated in the future, and it's going to happen, then you say, well, let's get the tax policy rolled out today before there's a large base to oppose it. So that would be the strategy that I think a smart policymaker would undertake. But again, they don't want it to be so onerous that they deter adoption of the technology altogether. You just want people to kind of use it more smartly.
Interesting. That was something personally I haven't even thought about. How do you anticipate existing road systems will support AVs? We talked about this a little bit, I know, but
I think successful. I mean, it's sort of it's a little bit circular logic, right? But I think it's sort of like successful AVs will be the ones that can use the existing road infrastructure. So, I mean, they'll support them by working for them. They'll work as well, as they do for current vehicle. I mean, there's kind of not much there. I mean, they'll support them. They have to. Otherwise, the vehicles won't be there, right? I mean, some of the state DOTs are looking at. There's some pretty nuts and bolts stuff like. What does this mean for like lighting and striping and maintenance and maintaining good repair on the roads? So there's some issues there, right? So you can say, yeah, we can build a vehicle. It doesn't need to we don't need to have, wires under the road. We don't need to have DSRC units every quarter mile, but that car still needs to orient itself to where it is on the roadway, and the way it does that is by looking at the paint. And if the paint's not there, then it can't see where it's going. So, that's, there could be some things there like, you need to just basically have good maintenance because these vehicles might not be able, human drivers can adapt to that, but, automated vehicles, their sensors may not allow them to do so.
So this may be inappropriate to ask this interview, but, we wanted to know. These automated vehicles are not being put in a world built for them. They're being put in our world with human drivers. And so they have these sensor systems, and it's really great vehicle to vehicle. You can get exact speed and location and distance. But do you know if currently manufacturers that are doing these test vehicles, if their sensors are put into place to deal in the ideal world or in the reality? We saw an article about a test drive that failed because it couldn't read the lane markings. Mm-hmm. Basically. So it seemed to us that perhaps that these vehicles are being developed in ideal circumstances and not in reality.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot in there, right? So, I mean, the short answer, this is why Google's, brought their car up to, I think, Kirkland, and they're doing some testing up here now because, they realize that they're doing all their testing in, Northern California and Silicon Valley, and it's, really ideal weather conditions, and it's also, it's frankly very suburban there, right? They're not testing them in downtown San Francisco, right? Or maybe they are a little bit, but the idea being it's a pretty controlled, highly engineered environment, very car oriented. And so, yeah, I think the developers realize they need to get out and test these things in a multitude of environments. So I think they know they need to do that, but anything starts in the lab, right?
Sure.
And you roll it out gradually. Now, the other thing that's interesting about is sort of how do they interact with human drivers is, I like to say, and I'm not the only one who's pointed this out, right? We have actually have V2V communication today. That's one of the roles of the driver, and we have not really V2I, but vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to pedestrian communication, and it's all through the driver, and it's eye contact and like subtle gestures, and I think a lot of that's like really hard to build, right? It's easy to build like a wireless protocol to send certain data, right? But how do you replicate a nod and a hand gesture? And so there's also people who are working on that. At the Automated Vehicles Symposium last summer, some of the OEMs and some of the suppliers were presenting work they've done, like how does this vehicle like communicate to, say, a cyclist, like, yes, I see you there, I'm aware, right? How do you get that confirmation that the vehicle sees you as a pedestrian or cyclist in particular? So they're working on that. That's my sense is that human factors piece is one of the less understood pieces of this overall.
Great.
But that's like, I assume that was going to be all that you guys wanted to talk about, being from HCDE, but
That's definitely interesting.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any more questions?
Actually, I was hoping if we have a few more minutes, if you would mind expanding on your studies about online shopping and freight and sort of how that will influence or be affected
I haven't
by it.
studied it.
Oh.
I just have opinions on it.
Oh, okay.
I mean, we looked at freight a little bit in the work that we've done on this, but it was primarily in like long haul. So looking at how does like intercity freight, like trucking, compete with like rail and air if you automate the trucks, and kind of much as with passengers, if you reduce the cost of the driver, then how does that affect demand? And so it was just pretty rough calculations. But I think in the urban setting, and so that will change kind of the supply chain, like further upstream. How do we get stuff from ports to cities and across the country? But then in the urban setting, there's this question of what will this do to? Well, there's a few questions, right? Which are like, how does so we reduce the cost of delivery essentially, and so once we reduce the cost of delivery by reducing the cost of the driver, how much more demand does that stimulate? And that's what we really don't understand, right? We know that on a trip-for-trip basis, it's generally much more efficient to have like trucks doing urban deliveries, going out and serving 10 or 50 or 100 homes on a route. Because you can optimize that, right? So you can have a truck go out and visit everyone and optimize that route, and it hugely cuts down on the VMT, substantially cuts down on the energy compared to all of those 50 people making an individual trip to the store. But what's not known is how many more trips are generated, right? So when I go to the grocery store, right, every week, I make one big trip. When I shop on Amazon, I'm like, I'm going to order this thing, okay? Yes, and I've got Prime, so I don't need to consolidate my shipment. So yes, I'm going to, Prime, ship it. I might have 5 shipments in a week, right? So that's 5 trips instead of 1. And then, in the end, I still end up going to the grocery store, but it's just to pick up one bag of things that, like, I forgot to order from Amazon, or they don't have the kind I like. So I'm still making that trip. I'm buying less stuff on that trip, but I've generated all these individual deliveries as well. And what we don't understand, and is sort of an open area of research, is, basically that shopping behavior and how do those interact, and what's sort of the rate of substitution between these deliveries and personal trips to the store. We just don't know.
Right.
I mean, we know directionally,
Sure.
kind of, but we don't really have a good handle on it.
Great, thank you.
Yes, you've been really helpful. Thank you
so
for doing
much.
this. Our last question is just like, do you have any specific resources you'd recommend us looking at? We're still kind of early on our paper.
So you mentioned up front, like, your goal is to design what? Like
We're
it's
not
to
even
understand.
designing.
No, it's to understand the needs of the. Wait, just articulate again what you said at the start.
Yeah, so
Content.
we're trying to unpack the content and context of autonomous cars, specifically in relation to infrastructure and sensor/navigation.
So what does that mean?
That's what we're working on as
So
a
we're-
team.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, what
trying
does
to-
context and content
Oh,
mean?
content and context. So our teacher, it was really confusing for me personally when we learned it, but content is how the thing works, the history of it, kind of like what it does, and then context is kind of more controversies and different parties that have different,
How it fits into society.
yeah, how it fits into
Oh, okay.
society.
Okay.
So,
And so then your final question was like, who else should you talk to?
yeah, well, books or talk
Other
to or,
resources. Have you talked to Ryan Kalo? Okay, so he's in the law school, and you should definitely talk to him. He's sort of a
How do you spell Kalo?
CALO. So he's a professor in the law school, and he's been doing some work in this area. He's sort of one of the leading guys in sort of like robotics law.
Mhm.
Yeah, we had a
Oh,
lot
wow.
of questions on laws, so.
Yeah, definitely talk to him then. You could also, you could talk to, there's this guy, there's a couple guys who have this sort of small nonprofit, Steve Marshall and John Niles, Niles. They might have something to say. Well, they'll have something to say. I don't know if they'll have time for you, but I mean, you'll get a slightly different perspective.
Is
than-
there startup robotics or cars?
Sorry?
Is there startup robotics?
No, sorry, I say startup, no, like nonprofit.
Oh, nonprofit.
Yeah.
Related to autonomous cars? Or?
Yeah, they're sort of like, their agenda is kind of to get these things integrated into the local transportation system in a way that conserves energy and,
Interesting.
preserves or enhances mobility. I don't know, like, you could talk to people at the DOTs, but I don't know. I mean, if you want more on the, like, what are the DOTs thinking about in terms of what they need to do, there's some people, but I actually don't think those guys would be the most useful.
Right.
Yeah.
They're mostly thinking about what do I have to do for, like, to keep the system running.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ryan would be the number one guy to talk to, though.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much for your time and for all your help.
Yeah,
This has been
no
great.
worries. Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for coming by.
Yeah.
And good luck.
Thank you.
All right.